The contents of the vault are rightfully the property of the Atlas Corporation. But you, you belong to me. Yes, the key works. Sergeant, get your team ready to go inside.
Before we talk about the second game, we need to talk about where it all started, Borderlands 1. Imagine for a few minutes that this video is actually titled Borderlands 1: How Not to Do a Villain. We've got to set up the groundwork before getting into the good bad guy. Released in October 2009, Borderlands introduced us to the world of Pandora, a planet with an unimaginable variety of guns begging to be looted from both the hands of bandits and the guts of its dangerous wildlife. While the game received critical praise, in retrospect it was primarily a large-scale tech demo of the gun randomization system Gearbox had created, with the side benefit of laying down the building blocks for what would become a new universe and popular franchise. In retrospect, it's easy to see that Borderlands 1 was very rough around the edges. Spotty hit detection, online multiplayer issues, weird loot drops, and one of the most underwhelming villains ever seen in a video game. Meet Commandant Steele, leader of the Crimson Raiders and Antagonist. She's already dead. Some of you familiar with the other games in the Borderlands series may be questioning who Steele is, and you'd be right to do so, because in the grand scheme of things, she was entirely irrelevant and didn't require much mentioning in subsequent games. Okay, trying to speak fairly here, she wasn't entirely worthless. Steele was the one who opened the first vault and effectively started the whole overarching goal of the series going forth. Finding and opening vaults basically became what every game's main goal was. However, if we take Steele out, the plot of Borderlands 2 and every other game would still have occurred regardless, because the Vault Hunters were already looking to gather the pieces of the Vault Key for their own gain. A big problem with Steele is that she isn't introduced into the game until about a third of the way through the main story. Up until that point, players are told that the goal of the game is to steal the pieces of the Vault Key from the bandit leaders across Pandora. There was no central villain to tie everything together. It was simply a journey for wealth and glory. However, Steele pops in via Echo after players defeat Sledge, the leader of a group of bandits, giving the game a top antagonist. Kind of. Her introduction is a bit of a clunky expository mess with almost no build-up. Steele's only implied connection is that she's looking for these same plot MacGuffins as the players, which in turn makes her the enemy. With this somewhat abrupt introduction, we already start to see the flaws in how they chose to handle the Commandant. She simply dropped in a significant portion of the way through the story, along with the entire existence of the Crimson Lance. This is a large part of why Steele isn't effective or memorable. She almost seems like an afterthought, especially with the way she factors in through the game's journey, only addressing the player a handful of times. As stated before, with the way Steele was implemented, it's almost as if she shouldn't have even been there in the first place. Either have the antagonist competing with the player from the start, or just let the player go on their journey across Pandora, with the local population being the obstacles to the goal. Heck, even the Iridian's Guardians that appear near the end of the game would have been enough of an obstacle for the Vault Hunters to overcome, in addition to the bandit leaders. With such a poorly executed antagonist in Borderlands 1, Gearbox knew they had to step it up for the sequel, and boy did they sure take a big step forward with the antagonist. Enter Handsome Jack, a man with money, power, and a massive narcissistic ego that made for one of the most memorable villains in gaming. Now, how did Gearbox go from one of the most forgettable to one of the most memorable villains in the span of a sequel? The answer is simple. He does everything Steele failed to do. To make things simple, let's create a list of major reasons Steele failed to do as an antagonist. She failed to have an impact on the overall story of the game. She also did not pose a legitimate threat to the player aside from throwing some of her soldiers at us. Steele certainly did not have an interesting character, or at the very least wasn't given time to develop one, and lastly, her death wasn't impactful. Right from the get-go, Jack is there. In fact, Jack is there before the game even begins, as he's the one who brought all the Vault Hunters together, orchestrating not just the intro cutscene that sets up the story, but the entire story that Borderlands 2 presents. The entire story of the first game is so easily summarized to the point where Marcus does so in the span of 20 seconds during the introduction.
First, there was the vault, an alien prison opened with a mystical key. To the warriors who opened it, the vault was just a container of tentacles and disappointment. They vanished into the wastelands, certain that the vault held no treasure at all. They were wrong.
Yep, that's basically all anyone needed to know. How do I know that? Because I personally played Borderlands 2 with no knowledge of the first game, and I had absolutely no issues following along with the story and the characters. Even with the amount of returning characters from the first game, they all got reintroduced anyhow. But back to Jack. Within the first 5 minutes of the game, Handsome Jack has already established himself as a threatening villain simply by his indirect interactions with the Vault Hunters in the intro. We're told Jack is the CEO of a large weapons manufacturer that has taken over Pandora via militaristic force to restore order to the barbaric planet, all while mining the valuable iridium ore that appeared after the first vault was open. He rounds up the Vault Hunters under the guise of hiring them to find the vault and attempts to murder them with his forces and lots of explosions. With the first lines Jack speaks, it's made clear here that he believes he's the hero of the story as opposed to our Vault Hunters.
It's cute that y'all think you're the heroes of this little adventure, but you're not. Welcome to Pandora, kiddos.
However, there is one major thing against Jack's status as an antagonist and as a character. He didn't exist in Borderlands 1. Upon his creation, they essentially had to add him into the story of Borderlands 1 by stating that he was behind most of the events because Guardian Angel was under his control. It became known that he used Angel to manipulate the Vault Hunters into pursuing the opening of the first vault. Even though this is essentially retconning, it added to Jack's presence, making him seem like he's been there the whole time, manipulating and killing just like he does in his starring role in 2, in which he's presented as a legitimate threat. Within the introductory period of the game, Jack has already a much more established and fleshed out motive than Commandant Steele ever had. Additionally, unlike Steele, Jack actually has a huge impact on the story since it basically all revolves around his efforts to open the vault and control/wipe out the citizens of Pandora. With Steele, by the time she came in, we had just began collecting the vault key pieces for our own gain, and were already told what our goal was, so the only threat she posed was taking the treasures within the vault for her and her army. With Jack, he actively sought to destroy Pandora, cleanse it of the bandit scum, all while making disgusting amounts of money off of iridium. Everyone's lives were in danger, making the stakes of failing to stop him much bigger and in turn more motivating for the player to defeat him. Although Jack was a massive threat to the planet of Pandora, being a threat doesn't necessarily mean you can't have an interesting and complex character. To me personally, this is the biggest and most important improvement between the two antagonists. Jack is known for his smarmy jerkbag attitude that's smothered in charisma and narcissism.
I'm racking my brain trying to think of a name for that diamond pony I bought. I was gonna call it Piss for Brains in honor of you, but that just feels immature.
A lot of what Jack is thanks to his voice actor Damian Clark and the performance he gives. But in addition, it's because Jack actually converses with the Vault Hunters throughout the entire adventure. Jack is there to not only remind the player that he's a looming threat, but also to mock them. The way in which he does this makes it so the player just loves to hate him. His charismatic banter towards the players is what sold him to most people.
Butt Stallion! Here, girl! Butt Stallion! Say hello! Yeah. Butt Stallion says hello.
Within the first hour of the game, you knew Jack was going to be something special. He wanted to make himself known to the Vault Hunters that were looking to stop him. He wanted to let them know he was a threat, that he was the real hero while also having fun with it. As we go through the game, by completing both main and side quests, we learn not just more about Jack, but also of his relationship with Angel. We learn he had an abusive grandmother that he ultimately killed. We learn that he imprisoned Angel to do his bidding after she supposedly killed her mother, and we learn that he will kill anyone who gets in the way, including other antagonists such as Flank Steak.
Oh, if you long enough. All right, $20 for rolling. That's my final offer.
Jack is a character who the writers took time and effort to give him history, and because of this and the events of the game, he changes as the story progresses, and not just his own feelings and attitude, but ours as well. His opinions and motives become unclear due to his manipulation and reaction to certain events. Once Angel dies, Jack's personality and interaction towards the Vault Hunter takes a shift. He stops jokingly mocking the Vault Hunters and begins to take everything much more seriously, with the desire for revenge and killing not just his daughter, but his source of information and power. In fact, Jack's response to Angel's death is a great example as to how complex his character is. It's difficult to tell if he's sad and angry because the Vault Hunters killed his baby girl, or if it's because a major source of his power and means of charging the Vault Key had been taken away from him. It would be easy to write off his reaction to her death off as an act, and that Jack didn't actually care about his daughter due to his megalomania, but I argue that he did, in his own twisted way, love Angel. I believe he did indeed care for his daughter, but his desire for power overshadowed this and led him to imprisoning her due to her status as a siren. As an example of this found in the pre-sequel, when first entering Jack's office on Helios, we see a picture of a young Angel who looks quite happy on his desk. Since the entirety of the pre-sequel revolves around the development of Jack and how we went from John the Programmer to Handsome Jack the Dictator, once the events of the game go down, upon returning to his office we see that he has placed the photo face down so that he can no longer see it, showing that he has completed his transformation into the man we see in Borderlands 2. Additionally, in Tales from the Borderlands, Hollow Jack talks in a somber tone when Reese points out a picture of Angel on his desk.
Who's this? Oh, yeah, that's my Angel. Don't usually like people knowing about her. You and me are pretty tight. Once we're done with all this vault stuff, I'd like to check up on her. That's cool.
This implies that he does actually care about her, since there would be no real reason to talk like he did about her. The thing is, it just wasn't enough to overthrow his desire to use her as a power. All this character and threatening presence only leads to a much more satisfying and impactful death. Once again, I present to you Steele's death.
Go inside.
Now compare that to how Jack went out. You not only need to fight him head on, but you need to fight the beast of the vault that he is controlling. In the end, you're given the option to kill him or let Lilith do the honors, but the important part is he doesn't die without having done something. Jack completed his goal in releasing the warrior, it just wasn't enough to beat the Vault Hunters. On the other hand, Steele dies before the final boss, after having only physically appeared on screen for about 15 seconds. Her death meant nothing, but maybe that was also the point. Her sudden death could have been used to show the players that anything can die at a moment's notice on Pandora, regardless of their importance to the story. The most tragic part of Steele, though, is the fact that she's ultimately a waste of a siren, which has become one of the most intriguing species in the Borderlands universe, with only 6 being able to exist at a time. Even though I've spent most of this video putting Steele down as a terrible antagonist, I do want to make it a positive point that Steele wasn't necessarily a bad villain for the game she was in. The idea of her role was there, and it was fine, but the execution of her role was what caused her to be so forgettable. For what little character we were able to see from her, Steele's more serious personality and role as the leader of an army was more fitting with how the world was presented in Borderlands 1. Before Borderlands 2 came in with its more insane humor and meme references, the Borderlands series was much more grounded. Pandora was a wasteland through and through with savage inhabitants whose minds had been twisted from the materials they were hired to mine. Pandora's inhabitants were much more serious and grounded as opposed to the ones in the second game, including characters that returned from 1. If a villain like Jack were used within a setting akin to 1, he wouldn't have worked nearly as well due to how much of a stylistic conflict he would be presented with. As great as an antagonist Jack is, there is no doubt that he's such an over-the-top villain, and a bad guy like that requires a world to fit within, and Jack fits in perfectly with what Pandora had become in Borderlands 2. It'll be hard for the Calypso twins to follow up Handsome Jack's iconic presence, but maybe their role as cult leaders with streamer-like personalities will make it so that they're able to adapt their personality to the type that each planet needs. But we'll have to wait and see whether they are worthy successors of the antagonist role within the Borderlands series.